animateur for today is very familiar to most of you because he's been a frequent participant in these cafes and a previous animateur, Professor Don Carmichael from the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta. Professor Carmichael got his BA and MA at Queen's and then his PhD at Toronto. He's co-author of a book on democracy and rights and equality, something like that. And published by Routledge? No.
Yeah.
Right. And his specialty has long been liberal democracy and rights, but he also is very interested in the history of political theory, particularly Hobbes and Aristotle. So, Don, I turn it over to you.
Are we ready to go? Thank you, Martin, and thank you, everyone. I want to join the others in welcoming everyone back for another season. Can I turn this down? I'm not as tall as Martin. There. That work? So I want to thank them for inviting me to come back. I really enjoyed the sessions in the past at which I spoke, but also, and I think even more of the sessions I attended, sitting in the pews. I am afraid this may be my last time, however. You may have seen me on the side frantically scribbling, and that's because I changed my mind about my line on the topic this morning. I was just thinking a whole lot about it and found it's a little more complicated than I thought. So anyway, here goes. The question is, does a fair society need overarching community and a common culture? I'm going to give a short and simple answer to this question because I want to go at a presupposition, something that lies beneath the question that I think will be with us through the whole of the fall. Thank you. So my short answer is that fairness in society doesn't require community and doesn't require a common culture. If you and I meet regularly for coffee, we might, after a while, decide to pay for it in different ways. We might each pay separately. We might instead decide to flip a coin for it. Or we might decide to pay in turns for the whole bill. Is any one of those more fair than the others? No. But now suppose that you're a believer in something, doesn't matter what it is, but it's really important to you, and I'm a disbeliever. Does that affect the fairness of it? No, we can still flip a coin, pay in turns, or each pay separately. What might be a problem is if one of us holds views about the beliefs of the other. For example, if I hold views about those really important beliefs you have that lead me to think on that account that you're just a jerk and not worth listening to, well then, fairness is going to become difficult. But the reason fairness is going to become difficult at that point is the conversations over coffee are going to become difficult and impossible. So what's important, it seems to me, for fairness to work is not that there be agreement on fundamental values or that even we be members of a common culture, but that we respect one another enough to listen to the other in ways that we're prepared to make room for the other in the activities we're pursuing. Now, that's to give, as I said, a short answer to the question, because it seems to me what's more important about that question is what lies behind it, that idea of a community and a common culture. So I want to ask, what's all that about? That would be a theme for all of our sessions. I want to start by suggesting that can be understood in some different ways, and I'm not sure that the standard way of understanding community and common culture is feasible or even desirable. But let me start there just by quoting from the statement, which I'm going to repeat something that Martin Tweedale said. just from the outline of the sessions, many philosophers since the Enlightenment have thought society could function very well without community and a common culture. And then this position arguably has contributed to a disintegration of community and a watering down of common culture within liberal democratic societies. Having experienced the application of that thesis over the last 100 years, in this series we revisited salient ideas and seek to think again about the importance of culture and community for a healthy society. In the end, the question is whether the notion of we has any real substance, or whether we are just a bunch of I's and we're better off that way. Note here the opposition between the we of the community and the bunch of separate I's. It seems to me, I want to start by saying I think that opposition can be understood in two different ways. The standard way, I think that we've come to think of it, but the standard way is juxtaposes the common culture on the one side against society as a set of atomic, unrelated, separate selves, each pursuing his or her own destiny, with perhaps interaction with others, but certainly the mantra there is we're born alone, we die alone, and we do our best in between the two. Well, that's become, I think, a very common conception. I think it's more common in talk than it is in practice. But still, it's important, and it has, in my opinion, really unfortunate results. Several other people in this series are going to take that up. I'd like to acknowledge its importance, but step around it to look at something related to it. Instead of juxtaposing the we of the common community with the I's of separate individuals, which I said I don't think really goes on. I think that's common enough in talk, but in reality, I think what we have is a somewhat different and much more recognizable problem. It's that there is no we of a common culture. What we have is an association of sub-associations. What we have in Canada is a community, a so-called community, where the individuals in it don't all share any one thing in common with one another, and don't have to. What we have is more, to use Joe Clark's phrase, a community of communities, or an association of associations. Is that a problem? I don't think so. I think it can be, but it doesn't have to be a problem. In this room, I would just say straight off the bat, I would be astonished if everyone in this room agreed on any one thing. What's more, I think we could, though, agree on one thing. That if that were true, our sessions would become more boring than they are otherwise. So this doesn't have to be a problem. But, of course, cultural diversity and fundamental cultural diversity is thought today to be a major difficulty. I'd like to challenge that. So here I want to start with something I heard on the BBC News last week. They had two accounts. One was from a little Englander. He was talking about, he founded some society for the preservation of English, read white, values. And he was talking about how in Luton, his city, 20 years ago, there were no mosques, and today, gasp, there are 29 of them. Right? This is all new. This is all terrifying, he says. The BBC juxtaposed that with a very well-spoken man who's a professed Muslim who says he wants to live under Sharia, or under Sharia law, even where that law differs from or conflicts with British statutory law. And he thinks he's entitled to that as a measure of freedom. And he said, I came to England to live here as a society of freedom. I came here to live. That's why I came here, to live in freedom. So I should be able to live my own way. I will pass over in silence. Well, I'll leave it for you to judge whether that's phony or true. It seemed to me, though, both views are phony, and I want to suggest, reaching back to the foggy recesses of my memory to my youth, I want to suggest that while the color of the picture may have changed, the picture itself isn't all that different. When I went to university, I'm not as old as this is going to sound. But maybe half this. I was raised in a good Irish Catholic household. Okay. When I went to university, I had never dated a Protestant. In the course of my first year at university, I wound up dating this delightful young woman, girls as we called them then, who turned out to be Jewish. I thought she was unbelievably exotic. It was just like all these books I'd read, and now I'd actually met one. If she had had 4 arms or some double set of breasts or something, she could not have been more exotic. Was this unusual? I don't know. I do remember at Christmas, we would get in the car and drive around our town and look at the lights on the Christmas lights. Some houses didn't have lights, and there would be incompletely muffled conversations between my parents about Jews or unbelievers in the front seat. What I'm trying to suggest is, by this, is that we had then a problem of cultural diversity and sometimes of deep cultural conflict, but they were less public. But were they problems? Well, I remember at that time John F. Kennedy prostrating himself before the Southern Baptist Convention, begging these ministers to let him be a candidate for the Democratic Party for president. I note today, looking back over my whole lifetime, that over that time, Catholicism in the United States has more adherents than mainstream Protestants. It's the largest group, but it has more adherents than either mainstream Protestants or evangelical Christians. And over that time, there's only been one Catholic president. There have been at least 3, by my count, evangelical Christian presidents. Do they have different points of view, different values? Yeah. Has that torn the United States apart? Well, perhaps it's going to, but the differences between them or among them, that's not what's going to be a problem for the United States. Intolerance might be. Inability to take seriously the viewpoints of others, that might be. But the fact of difference, that's not a problem. Indeed, now, I want to say like 2 things, and yeah. I want first of all to say I think that's not a problem, or doesn't have to be a problem. But then, drawing on the work of 2 of my favorite philosophers, Stuart Hampshire and John Rawls, I want to suggest it calls for a different kind of solution than perhaps we're used to thinking about, and a different way of understanding community. It doesn't have to be a problem, it seems to me, because whether we're talking about religious differences or religiously based differences, or whether we're talking of culture, it seems to me inescapable and inevitable that reflective people are going to disagree about basic issues. I don't think it's possible to have a society of adult people who are reflective, who agree on all the fundamentals. I would invite you to think of the number of times in your life that you've had a conversation on something that you care about. It might be Shostakovich. I remember there's a famous story of the historian who wrote Hitler a Study, Alan Bullock. There's a famous story of Alan Bullock and Isaiah Berlin disagreed intensely about Wagner as a composer. And they used to argue this, and they were never able to settle the argument. Well, here's a case, and I think you've all had the same experience of having a disagreement with someone whom you respect, whose views you respect, even though they're clearly wrong. They're wrong because they're not yours. The issue may never get settled. Now, I wouldn't suggest for a minute that everyone in our community achieves that level of reflection about their views. I'm just going to engage in a kind of pretense for a few moments that everyone does. We know that's not true. But a lot of people are like that, and they matter. And the reason it matters is this, that when we come to an issue, such as, for example, deciding our public holidays, when we come to an issue where there is disagreement, there has to be a solution. And the solution is going to mean that some people get their way and other people don't. But it's more than that. It means that some people whose views have every bit as much right and reason to be established as the others, those people are going to be made to do something that they would rather not, that they believe to be wrong. If you take the equality of human beings and the equality of your fellow citizens seriously, you have to be troubled about that. That, at any rate, is the view that Hampshire and Rawls have argued in various ways. You have to be... Coercion is inescapable in public life if you take the view, as I do, that there will always be differences. But we can coerce in different ways. We can coerce on a basis of a fair recognition of the equality of others, or not. This seems to me the standard way we have always done this in Canada, at least I shouldn't say always, but certainly through my lifetime, is the majority prevails. And then we evolved into a system where we'll have the majority prevails protected by a so-called Charter of Rights, which is really, as you'll see in a few moments, the interpretations of some justices on the various courts. But the core idea here is that at a certain point, we have a public holiday such as Christmas. Christmas is an interesting day to have as a public holiday. It's a very interesting way to celebrate our common citizenship. Do we want to talk about a common culture around Christmas? Do we want to tie our sense of community to accepting Christmas as the way that we celebrate that common citizenship? Well, we have done so, and it's justifiable in the sense that there has to be some way of doing it, so the majority get to prevail, and the people losers who don't like it, well, they can get together next time, and if they can, and prevail. So we have that sort of justification. I think the Marxists among the group, including myself, would say there's more power involved in this than anything else, but that's the view. That justification, however, rather conveniently masks the case that some people, in the name of common community, are being asked to act in ways in which they don't believe. Well, it's one thing to say to people, well, we got to have a decision. Well, we have to decide whether we're going to drive on the right side of the road or on the left side of the road. Okay? So we're going to have to take a decision, and there will be winners and there will be losers. That's one thing. But it's another thing to say that when the decision is taken, that represents the values of the community. So you as a citizen, are caught up in that. I want to illustrate that, if I can, with an example. I'm just going to abuse. I want to give you an example. In 1993, the Supreme Court was asked to hear a case brought by Susan Rodriguez, who asked for an exemption in the matter of assisted suicide. She was dying of ALS. When it got to the Supreme Court, the majority said no, it couldn't happen. One of the key provisions was Section 7 of the Charter, which guarantees the right to security of the person, to life, liberty, and security of the person. Mr. Justice Lipinka, writing for the majority, had some very interesting things to say about this. First, he routinely treated the idea of the right to security of the person as equivalent to what he called the sacredness of life. He then said, the sacredness of life quite clearly does not allow the right to end it. So a right to life is a right to something that is sacred and too sacred to allow it to be ended. And he went on to say, at least that is what the majority in the community think now, and no alternative consensus has evolved. Well, I'm quoting here, and I'm quoting because I don't want to pick on a judge or a lawyer or anyone like that, but I want to say that, this passed without virtual comment at the time. So I want to draw in this two things to your attention. The first was the ease with which a fairly anodyne, a fairly blanket expression, security of the person, got treated authoritatively as meaning the sacredness of life, and where that sacredness of life was thought to be a value such that the person whose life it is has no right to decide to end it. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the ease with which the court hid behind what they called the majority of the time. Now I want to put this to you. As it happens, Sue Rodriguez had a lifelong terror of drowning, and you may know that ALS victims typically die in that way. Their lungs fill up with fluid and they collapse. So we could say to Ms. Rodriguez, we're sorry, but there has to be a decision on this matter, and unluckily for you, you lose. We could say that. Or we could say, we've thought about it, and the values of our community, including the community to which you belong, require that you die in this horrible way. Now, I think that is just insulting. Interestingly, the court judgment was dressed up in all kinds of talk about compassion for the person. I'm not talking here about compassion for Rodriguez. I'm talking about an insult to her person. That I'm trying to suggest that that it violates her in a fundamental way to expect her to live under values which she clearly does not, where those values are reasonable. So what does this mean? Does it mean that that decision should not have been made? No. It does mean that it might have been described and justified in a different way. Does it mean that we don't have public holidays? No. But we might take as our central public holiday some date that is not tied to a religious tradition. Interestingly, I raise this in classes sometimes, and kids routinely say, but you're going to take Santa Claus away from kids. That's not what that's about. We could have, I say to them, change the name to Santa Claus Day and I'm with you. No problem. Treat it the way the day of biggest travel in the United States, as you may know, is Thanksgiving. Okay, so what does this mean? For John Rawls, it means something which I profess I'm not entirely sure I buy, and because I know I don't understand it as well as I would like to. But Rawls says when it comes to fundamental matters of our public life, fundamental matters of citizenship, such as public holidays, the justifications of basic decisions, it is imperative that each of us step out of our own life commitments. We step out of our own views about what's true and find a way to justify our views to other people, dressed in terms that other people reasonably can accept. So if you want to justify a prohibition on assisted suicide, there is language you can use. You can talk about the need to protect the vulnerable. But to expect everyone in the community to accept a formulation which presupposes adherence to Christianity and to a Christian view of life is, I think, a violation of the equal rights of those citizens. If they have to be coerced, okay. But don't coerce them in the name of the values of a community where they don't accept that community. So where does this leave us? It means, I think, two things. So if I could come back to the fairness idea. It means, I think, that we need to be a little more careful about our understanding of community. We don't have to give up the idea of community. We're in this together. We sink or swim on some fundamental points together. So we don't have to give that up. But we have to be careful, though, about how we understand that community and those common projects. We have to understand those common projects in ways that very clearly recognize that other people reasonably see fundamental issues in ways that are different from us, and that as such, they are owed by us as we are owed by them the basic duty that our common life be described and justified in terms that don't require adherence to any one person's particular life outlook. Thanks very much.
Now, as you may recall, our, sorry, Don, didn't mean to frighten you. I am a little bit concerned about what you said because of what would happen to that marvelous carol that I'm familiar with on the first day of Marxmas my comrade gave to me, and whether that might fade away under these circumstances. But as you may recall, our approach to the conversation is in this fashion. The person who wishes to speak first, to respond, to raise issues, to inquire, I would like others then who wish to speak to that particular theme or issue to raise their hand. And then after we hear from several people, I will ask if somebody would like to come at it a little differently than that. It just makes for a little bit of a richer opportunity for us. So who would like to be first?
Thank you. Well, thank you for that lucid and stimulating introduction. But as you spoke on the nature of community, it struck me that there are communities and communities, open and closed. And in a society like North American society, to some degree, I think we've redefined community a bit. What popped into my thought was a picture of some New Yorkers celebrating St. Patrick's Day. They were all dressed in green, and they had little Irish pipes and hats and so on. And the only thing that was a little bit odd about this celebration of Irishness was that they were all West Indians. They were black. And I thought, we've redefined our notion of community here, and this is perhaps a product of being a community of communities. Could I throw that thought out and ask you to comment on it?
Yes, of course. I grew up, for reasons that will be obvious from something else I said, I like college football in the United States. I grew up cheering for Notre Dame. Then I just stopped watching sports on TV for many, 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 many years. 3 years ago, I turned on the TV one day to watch Notre Dame play. And when I saw the bench, I was amazed. There were no white guys on the team at all, so far as I could see. So, what does that mean? I don't think St. Patrick's Day was ever a day of... I suppose for the New York Irish, it was a day that was very sacred to them. Maybe they get uncomfortable when they see non-Irish people celebrating or see that "Kiss Me, I'm Irish" thing. But I'm tempted to say that, in my opinion, we should replace Christmas with St. Patrick's Day. That's the day that would be. It celebrates really important things like alcohol and civic violence and beating up on people you disagree with. Those do seem closer to our actual life practices. All right. The reality behind the question, it seems to me, is what happens when these cultural traditions shift. And you made to express reference to closed society, so I thought you were going to go somewhere else. There is a point of connection in that. When I cited the case of Kennedy in 1960, Kennedy had to persuade the Protestant community in the United States that he would not be the slave of Vatican City, that he would not, as president, always do exactly what the Pope told him to do. Now, I think we see, what he had to combat there, I think, was the view seen by others that the Catholics of the period were a closed society. I myself would say that to take that view about a practicing politician shows that any closedness isn't just on one side. Right? It's a remarkably insulting thing to say about a senator of the United States, that he would passively do what he is told to by the head of his religion, whatever that would be. And I remind you, that's happened recently in Canadian politics, particularly with Catholic bishops instructing their parishioners that they should not vote for selected candidates because of their views on abortion. Views which seem only to have helped the candidates in question. So, I mean, all I can say in answer to that is that you're right that we do have dramatic demographic shifts, and you're also right to suggest, however carefully you did it, that there are real problems in this with people who don't listen. In fact, let me just say one thing more, if I may. My single favorite book in all of time, I don't ask other people to accept this, but my single favorite book is Plato's Republic. And Plato's Republic opens with a slave catching Socrates' sleeve and saying, "My master bids you wait. We want to have a conversation tonight." Right? And so they're going to have a conversation about right and wrong. And very early, Socrates says, what are they talking about? Yeah, whether they're going to do it. And so they're going to persuade people to join them in this conversation. And the question comes up, but how can you persuade people who don't listen? So right on the first page of this great seminal work in our tradition is flagged the problem of the person who is either uninterested or not gifted enough or overcommitted in ways that make them not open to persuasion, not open to reason. Yes, of course, that's a problem. I don't think it calls for automatically for an assumption that, well, we'll just choose sides. And where you're right, I'm sorry I have to go on with this, but it really touches things I care about deeply. See, I think that's a real problem in politics today. I don't think it's a problem with Sharia communities or others alone. I'm really impressed by a certain statistic. I think you might agree with me that my view is that over my lifetime, the level of civility in public life has gone down. And over my lifetime, the level of commitment of the average voter, I mean the person who actually votes, the level of commitment and how much they know about what's going on has gone down. There are studies that show that. It's also my experience. I want to juxtapose that line that looks like that with another line that looks like that, which is that exactly over that period there's been a steady and really quite monumental increase in the amount of post-secondary education. It strikes me as astonishing that we are, on the one hand, a very much better educated society, and on the other hand, a society that seems to know less and care less about civility in public life. Makes you want to run back a little bit and qualify that expression that we might be a more educated society, but we may not be a better educated society. Okay, I owe you I've not been stalling on this. I'm really troubled by the issues that Nicholas raised. So, like one of them had to do with the Black Irish. One of them has to do with phony multiculturalism. But the more important issue has to do with the quite clear reality that on important matters, people are disinclined to be persuaded otherwise and disinclined to hear other points of view. My short answer to that is, that's the hill we have to climb.
I think I'll just toss one little matter in here. What do you think is, or how do you deal with the place of cultural memory in the life of let's say in the life of a particular country, when that country obviously ours being a good example, but there are many other dramatic examples. Through the 20th century goes through a series of cataclysmic upheavals, and where in fact there is a profound change, where pluralism does become a really important matter. Is there, how can I put this? Is there some civil value to cultural memory that we ought to pay some attention to in thinking through what you've laid before us?
Absolutely, without qualification. I'm not saying we don't have many things worth remembering. I'm saying that those things we have that are worth remembering are more textured than the claims of common culture make them out to be. I'm actually troubled by the fact that our students know so little history. They get a kind of history under the guise of social studies in the high schools, but it's an eviscerated history. I once gave a lecture. I was trying to be funny about teaching first-year students. I was trying to be funny, about the way Canadian federal politics worked back when the Liberals had been running the country for a long time. So I gave this lecture on John A. Macdonald's winning coalition and how he had put the various elements together, which have been kind of the earmarks for federal electoral success since then. But I routinely described Macdonald as a Liberal. I was much younger then and didn't know any better. And one of the things I didn't know any better, what I should have known better was that they wouldn't think that was funny. What I didn't realize at all was that they had no idea who John A. Macdonald was. They had no idea who John A. Macdonald was. This was, I stopped at one point, because I was puzzled that they weren't laughing. So I said, do you know who Sir John A. Macdonald is? And they said, yes, sir. You said he's a Liberal. Do you know who he... No. Some of the kids did know, but routinely, it's bizarre that students in a first-year class on political science would not know the name of our country's first prime minister. That's not cultural memory, but I cite it as an instance of those of a kind of historical, and it's not amnesia, it's a lack of, we have words like innumeracy for not being able to deal with numbers, and illiteracy for not being able to read. Is there a word like ahistorical?
I don't think there is, but there ought to be.
There really ought to be, like an unawareness of to know the history of the community you live in is not to be obliged to do things as we did 100 years ago. You might expect people to find them interesting. You might hope that people would think there were things they could learn from them, but no, I think that's really fundamentally important. So, and one of the critical elements of that is that there are very strong strands and traditions of cultural and religious tolerance in this country that have to be offset against traditions or groups that go the other way. But we have a great deal to celebrate in those respects.
And also maybe there's a question at what level at what level you have community sanction. I think, for example, of Raymond, Alberta. Everybody's been to Raymond. Small little town in southern Alberta, which is largely Mormon. Very wide streets, the way in which they were planned in all the Mormon towns throughout southern Alberta. But it is also a place where you have a small Japanese Buddhist community, and where there is a columbarium, so Japanese internees who died, often their ashes were sent to Raymond, Alberta. In the Japanese community, they celebrate the major feast in Japan is Obonodori. It is a feast of the ancestor, where you go to the cemetery and then you come home. There's a dance, kind of ritual dance, to the cemetery and back home. And in Raymond, Alberta, the Japanese Buddhists simply did that because that was their culture. So they would do it in August. They would have their gathering and people would dress up a bit and they would dance their way to the Raymond Cemetery and do what they were going to do there, burn a little incense, offer a little food. And sometimes their Mormon neighbors were there bringing flowers to their deceased. And I know on one occasion one of the Mormons came up to good old Mac Nishiyama, a good friend of his, and said, "Mac, when is your relative going to come up and eat the food?" And Mac said, "About the same time Yura comes up and smells the roses." So, but what happened there in the local world is that the Mormon community, the burgomeisters of the town, came to the Japanese and said, "You know, we really think what you're doing is important. Would it be okay with you if we would make Obun Cemetery Day for Raymond?" So on the local level, no coercion, simply an awakening to an opportunity around a deep common impulse, given different forms.
Yeah. What did you think? There were two or three people.
Yes. Are you on the same topic? No, are you on the same? Did you want to speak to this issue or did you want to shift it? Okay.
Don, thank you very much for your insightful talk.
You're the one who raised this issue last year on at least 2 different occasions. So we have to step outside after.
Okay. There's a couple of things that I just want to raise. The first is with regards to your example of Sue Rodriguez. As a member of the medical community, I was involved in researching and writing about the Sue Rodriguez case. And things are not always as they seem. In Sue Rodriguez's case, the palliative care community was quite concerned because, in fact, patients with ALS don't have a horrible death of suffocation as you describe. In fact, if they have adequate palliative care, it's well known in the palliative care community that the patients usually have a very peaceful death, dying in their sleep if they're adequately cared for. So what was presented to her and to the community was wrong. The second thing was that some of the people, high-level people involved in her case, were subsequently found to be fraudulent, signing for her and doing things on her behalf which were completely inappropriate. And thirdly, in her case, there was her authorized biographer wrote that, you know, when Sue was asked about did she really want to pursue this, and if she had been loved and cared for, did she really want to die? And she completely backed down. The reality was she had been abandoned. The point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, the way that it appeared to her in her particular circumstances, the response may have been insulting. But for society as a whole, these fundamental values that we have worked, for example, the sacredness of life, yes, in that particular situation, it may have appeared insulting to her. The same way if we don't allow a 14-year-old girl whose boyfriend has dumped her to end her life because she is depressed, because we have these fundamental values about the sacredness of life, may also be insulting to her. So I think that there is value about fundamental values in a society and making decisions accordingly, regardless of whether it appears insulting in individual circumstances. The second point I want to make relates to this concept of the word fair. The fundamental question here, is a fair society. These words like fair and reasonable are incredibly subjective, because what I consider reasonable, you may consider absolutely bananas. And what I consider fair, you may consider unfair. So in a society, as a political scientist, when we look about making political decisions for a good society, if I decide as a ruler to vote against female circumcision, to vote against having multiple wives, to vote against inferior value for women, I may consider that to be fair, but there is others who may consider that to be grossly unfair. So we have many things in a society that are mutually exclusive. And when one point is taken, necessarily the other groups will consider it unfair. So this whole concept of fair, to me, is a little bit meaningless. Thank you so much.
Can I take that up?
Oh, please do.
Well, no, I asked whether I can take it up because I think you raised, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Stephen.
Stephen? I don't know, I imagine a lot of people here will want to get in on the second of the two issues you raised, and so I would strongly invite that. But just maybe with a view to turning the pot a little, let me say something about each of the 2 points you raised. The first is, thank you very much for the correction on Rodriguez. Of the several points you made, I knew the last, that she had been significantly abandoned, that it wasn't something that she wanted to do. That I knew, but I didn't know the other features, and I'm really, really happy to be corrected on that. I did not realize that a peaceful death was actually available to her, and so I'm glad to be corrected on that. That, of course, is a matter of correction, doesn't speak to the fundamental issues we're concerned with. And on that, I would like to defend against what you say about fair. I agree with everything you say, but not the conclusion you draw from it. Everyone thinks, I don't know, there's a certain kind, we go back to St. Patrick's Day, there's a certain kind of ex-Catholic Irishman who thinks everything, he regards himself as a worthless piece of shit. But those people aside, myself aside, I think people generally think that what they're doing is right, and generally think that what they're doing is fair. It would be quite uncommon for a person routinely to say, but is this fair? So of course, in any poll you would take, or any instant question you would ask people, you will get very divergent views about fairness. So, female circumcision is fair, is unfair. But my answer to that is, so I agree, there is that divergence. I don't agree that it's reasonable. I don't agree that it's reasonable unless two things have happened. The person has thought about it, and they have thought carefully about it after listening carefully to people who disagree. I don't see that as something that happens a lot. You may disagree. So I'm tempted, but I am tempted to treat the cases that you cite as cases of each person's natural, life-sustaining belief that they're a reasonable person and that what they're doing is fair. But actual fairness involves more than that. Fairness involves this kind of thing. And you can't weigh up a case unless you know you can't weigh one case against another unless you know the best thing that can be said for that other case. And that seems to me to be what's lacking, and that's why it seems to me that the attention to fairness does lead, at least leads me to think that we have to be very careful about how we state our views when we're going to legislate them. I mean, no one is saying by this that you and I can't go argue about euthanasia-assisted suicide. The issue is only that if at a certain point when the legislatures are going to pass a law, that law should be stated in terms, and it should be defended or justified publicly in terms that reasonably can be accepted, not agreed with. Right? We're not talking about people who are going to say, oh, well, you put it that way, I have to agree. They just have to see that it is a reasonable decision that is taken after the relevant points of view have been heard carefully and weighed carefully. Now, yeah, come back.
Thank you very much for your response on, and I think we can, perhaps agree to disagree, but there's one point that you raise that I just want to highlight. You indicated that the fact that, we need to look at the opposing sides and to carefully assess them for their reasonableness, so to speak. But the reality is is that in the discourse and in the narrative of our society, that the public is generally not presented with the opposing sides. If we look at the Sue Rodriguez case right there, you as an intelligent, informed professor have taken a perspective based on misinformation. And the reality is that the way that many issues are presented to society for which they are making decisions that they consider reasonable are not really informed. And so I think we could agree that yes, we do need to hear the different perspectives, but discourse in society is not usually about hearing the various perspectives. It's usually the preponderance of those who have the power where most of the information is being delivered. And until that is changed, we can't have a fair discussion.
I think we really do agree on almost all of the facts, but we weigh them differently. For example, when you were saying those nice things about me, Martin Tweedale, who's known me professionally for a long time, just broke out into laughter. He thinks what you're saying is ridiculous. I want to say that I suspect you're strongly saddened by the facts you cite. I don't hear you taking any pleasure or celebration in them. I'm obviously really saddened too, and I'm especially saddened we're in different lines of work. Right? It's sad for me to say after 40 years of teaching in a major university to cite the fact that I gave you a little while ago about what I see as the decline of respect for public dialogue. That just, what the hell. But then I want to say a couple of things. I think the main issue that you cite calls for institutions. So what I'm saying is that fairness has to be binding upon legislators. It has to be binding upon public officials. It doesn't have to be binding on people in the street. When students or other people go to the bar and like they want to argue about euthanasia or abortion or whatever, let them. It doesn't have to have any play there. It does have to be, where it has to have play is in our public space. And our public space is generally constituted, that's not the right way to put it, our public space is generally marked out by institutions. And so you have to do things such as being elected or being appointed to get a voice in those public institutions. So it's not unreasonable to require this kind of reasonableness in those institutions. That said, if you and I, we could maybe, there are some people who can talk about hockey teams forever and ever, and I don't get it. I like the game, but I love sitting over a glass of something arguing about politics, right? And I suspect you and I could have an argument. You could name all the people who are manifestly deficient in this reasonableness in the Alberta legislature, the Parliament of Canada, and I'd be naming all kinds of people who are exemplary in that, and you'd be going, yep. For me, what it really comes down to is places like this. The more that we talk to one another, the more that people who care about the issues talk to one another, the more reasonable they're going to be led to be, in my experience. That's just all my political life. It has been like that. And so for me, the fundamental task for this kind of thing is to try to get it out of the media and to try to get it out of the instant solution. We need a solution right away, and to get it into formats where people who care can encounter one another without having to be bothered by all the many who don't.
I just had a couple of very quick comments to make, Don. I'm a bit uncomfortable because I'm normally primed for argument and contestation. But in this occasion, I actually am very sympathetic to what you've been saying. So a couple of really quick points. Without sounding too pedantic, I've always thought that the French social thinker Émile Durkheim had a very elegant narrative to discuss some of the things that you've been talking about up there. Because as I recall, Durkheim, of course, distinguished between those traditional communities based upon what he called mechanical solidarity, which had very strong values, very strong norms, which you describe in your leaflet as overarching sense of community and a strong common culture. Now, these are traditional communities. And I've always thought that they've had very good points and from my perspective, very bad points. You were talking about the Irish connection there. Growing up in Northern Ireland, I can tell you in the Falls Road in Belfast or the Bogside in Derry, I mean, these were very tightly knit Catholic communities which supported each other, played their own hurley Gaelic football. But at the same time, any woman who was ever suspected of dating a British soldier could be tarred and feathered. And any kids that jacked cars and went joyriding could be beaten up quite severely or kneecapped. So these are what I call restrictive codes, and they happen in any traditional community. In some communities we know honour killings are still unfortunately performed in parts of Afghanistan or Pakistan. In some communities we know that thieves still have their hands amputated. People can be executed for apostasy or heresy or homosexuality and God knows what else. And even in 18th century Britain, thieves used to have their hands amputated. Women who were regarded as scolds were put in the docking stools, and other common criminals were put into the stocks and the pillory and so on and so forth. So Durkheim's point is that in traditional societies we have these very strong norms and values which are often shared by people on the basis of common likeness. They share the same culture, the same language, the same religion. But Durkheim then goes on to say that as societies develop more complexity, the division of labour increases, that the basis for that kind of shared common values translated into punitive legal codes, the basis for that begins to break up. And we enter what he calls a society based on organic solidarity rather than mechanical solidarity. It's Martin Teasdale's version of Törles's Gemeinschaft into Gesellschaft. But this is why I'm bringing up Durkheim. Because Durkheim says that even though the common consciousness, the conscience collective, weakens with the modernization and secularization of society into its new forms, we can still translate the old codes into broader, more inclusive secular codes. This is, I think, a great contribution that Durkheim makes. And so instead of having Sharia law, which has all of these very harsh punishments for certain offences, or old Anglo-Saxon laws, or Irish laws for that matter, we're forced in a sense to find a more common basis for the legislation that we have. The legislation becomes more abstract. It's translated into charters of rights and fundamental freedoms, or into constitutions. And this is what I would call a more open, inclusive code, whereas the earlier ones were what I would think of as restrictive codes. And our notions of fairness are necessarily multiculturalized and relativized, but they're still capable of being brought into a consensual basis upon which most of us can agree, even if it's at the lowest common denominator. We can still agree that murder is wrong, that rape is wrong, and so on and so forth, and we can prescribe punishments which are appropriate to a multicultural society. That's my first point. My second point is very, very quick. On the question of fairness, I've always thought, in a sense, it's very difficult to superimpose a kind of universal sense of fairness for a number of reasons. But for one reason, is because I see societies falling on a continuum from those societies which, at least rhetorically, embrace absolute freedom as the most important value, to those societies on the other end which embrace absolute equality. So in the United States, for all its faults and the problems that we have, you can still, is it the Second Amendment rights? I can never remember. You can still stand in the middle of the country and say that you don't believe in the Holocaust. You can still say that our president is a war criminal, and you're probably going to get away with it because freedom of speech on many levels, even though it may have been eroded, is still upheld as a kind of sacrosanct right. On the other hand, you can go to Cuba and you find that doctors and lawyers probably live very similar houses to farm workers and labourers, that the ratio of differential is much less than it is in many other countries. Not like the Soviet Union, where they used to have the elite nomenclatura right at the top. Cuba, I take as an example of a far more radically egalitarian society. So extreme equality, extreme liberty, and maybe the Scandinavian Norway falling somewhere in between, restricting equality and restricting freedom of expression to a certain extent, but trying to get the best of both worlds. But I just like to throw that in to any conception of fairness, because some countries radically differ as to how they embrace freedom, absolute freedom, and others absolute equality.
Well, maybe we should, well, two points, I guess. One might, your point, second point, which you described as brief, I think is in fact a huge issue. I want to echo what you say on your first point and hope that people who disagree with me will instead attack you, since we agree on that. That would be nice. One additional feature of that, I mean, you know, when Tony was talking about a culture in transition, which is, what culture is not in transition? When we're talking particularly about a culture making that kind of transition, as you said, translatability gets to be really important. But I think one of the really interesting things about encountering people who disagree with you, or particularly people who have practices that look just totally weird, but where the people themselves seem to be quite reasonable. And so when you look further, that kind of cultural juxtaposition also is a spur to that process of translation. And I mean by that, we start with the practice is everything. It's just, we do exactly as we're taught to do. But there's a point to that, or there's a spirit behind it, as there's a spirit, hopefully, behind the rules we follow. We don't ordinarily think about that spirit or that point because we don't have to. But when we're driven up against a juxtaposition with people who do things very differently, we do have to think about what the point of it is. And sometimes we can preserve that point very easily by just transforming the way we talk about it or some of the things that we do. With Christmas, for example, does it matter? I mean, what matters with Christmas? Is it the birthday of baby Jesus? Is it a day when we celebrate coming together? Is it a day when we celebrate love? Is it a day when we set aside for families? There are all those different things. You can have almost all of them without any difficulty, without it being sacramentalized within a dominant religion. But to do that, of course, you've got to think about what it is you want out of it, what the point is of it. And there, I think what you were saying about the process of culture and transition is really to the point. The other thing I wanted to say, if you want to get into fairness, I said my answer on that was going to be short and simple, and I could have added stupid, because I wanted to get at this other issue. But since you raise it, I follow, until 10 years ago, I would have shot myself or anyone else who said this, but I follow Aristotle on this point. I think what Aristotle has to say about fairness is right on the money. Aristotle says we talk about fairness in two different ways. In one way, what's fair is what's done. That's just the code. In other words, if, speaking from my own, I should say my own experience, if you're in a university where, let's say, where men routinely get better grades than women because they're men, like, that's clearly unfair. But if a guy's in a class like that, he's going to have cause for complaint if he doesn't get that higher grade, because that's the way the system has been working. It's founded a set of expectations, and so he has a kind of claim under those expectations. So one sense of fairness is just what's done. And so if we go to Stephen's point, that's why when people start using fairness, it can be a problem, because they can be talking, what they mean by fair, it can mean, we've always done it this way. That dictates what's due to people. But the other sense of fair goes more to the point of what you're doing. And there, like the core idea Aristotle says, and I suspect you would agree, I may be wrong, we'll find out. But what Aristotle says is, the other sense of fairness is treating people according to their merits. So, that's all. Now, we can disagree about what the merits are, and we can be mistaken in the identification of the merits. That's all. There's lots of room for argument there. But we don't have a culturally shifting sense of fairness. Fairness in that sense means treating people according to their merits or their due or what they have coming to them. You can fill that in different ways. But that contrasts with this broader sense that we have of your due is what the ordinary practices are. So thus, I would say, in a simple teaching situation, to allocate time or grades on the basis of gender might be fair in one kind of system, but unfair in another sense. In our system, it would be unfair in both senses. So, like, why do I say that? I'm trying to sort of defend the objectivity and the reasonableness, I'm trying to defend the possibility of reasonable argument about what's fair. And I don't think it has to be just a matter of what you basically believe in.
Yeah, I'm more or less in agreement with you on this business about fairness. I think it's easy to over-exaggerate the significance of disagreements. I mean, it's in many individual cases, there are so many different factors to be considered that, of course, reasonable people may disagree about what's fair and what's not. But that doesn't show that the notion is useless. That's in response to Stephen. Also, but I'd like to back Stephen up in one thing here, and that is that I have the feeling this business of, well, what we need to do is get a conversation going, have this discussion, and talk about our differences, and somehow arrive at something or other, I don't know, or just agree to disagree and not do anything. I find this hopelessly idealistic. In fact, democratic discussion is by and large dominated by those with power and wealth. And insofar as that's the case, inevitably there's going to be pretty clear cases of unfairness. I mean, people who don't have power and wealth are not going to see their particular values get anywhere near as much a show in public policy as the values of the wealthy and powerful. So that's the first point I'd like to make. And then the second point I'd like to make is that I think one of the advantages of having a fairly well-formed common set of values and culture in a society is that it does put restrictions on how far people with power and wealth can go in forcing their own ways on everybody else. Once you start losing a fairly well-formed, not some sort of extremely wishy-washy set of values, but a fairly well-formed group, well then power and wealth can get away with just about whatever they want. And that's going to lead to unfairness. So that's would be my argument against your position on this question. That is, I think without the strong cultural values, you're going to inevitably allow power and wealth to exercise far too much influence over public policy, and there will inevitably be a lot of unfairness.
So the philosophy professor is claiming to speak to power against the idealistic and utopian political scientist. That's waited all my life for something like that. Just one little thing to get it out of the way. I dearly hope I did not give anyone the impression that I think this is a fair society. I don't think it is. I think it's pretty fair in lots of ways, but with some egregious, dreadful cases of systematic unfairness. And I agree with what you say, that like our system is run by those with power. Yes. That's not what's in issue. What's in issue between us is, I think, just one thing. You evidently believe that there is a common culture, and I don't. I don't think there is. Like, I could imagine 2 first-year university courses that we could develop. One would be a university course in the common culture of Canadian citizenship. These are all the things we believe. As in, I don't know what I did with it, but the we of real substance, as opposed to just a bunch of eyes. That's one thing we could do. The other thing we could do would be to have a course that would try to stoke up the textured historical memory. And where we might, I would like to see a first-year university course over here at the University of Alberta where every student would have a cohort experience for like 3 hours a week, where it's racially and culturally segmented, and where at the end of the year, hopefully they would have been put together in a way that they would get curious about why people dress and eat differently, and what the point of that is, and where it comes from, and they would learn to appreciate it. I think that would be really neat. I don't want to make the issue between us too simple, but because there are values that are broadly shared in Canada. It's just like we all, somebody used examples, like we all abhor rape, pillage, the exploitation of children, and so on. Yeah. It's just that the things that feed those values come from many different sources. And I believe people are politically more effective to the degree that they are aware of those sources and proud of them. So what I want is, I want to downplay the idea of common values and understand that that we have values and practices that are broadly shared inside the realm of quite significant disagreement, where we have to pay attention to those disagreements some of the time. That is, I think, a disagreement between us.
Yes, when it comes to ensuring thoughtful and reflective, reasonable debate when we go to making laws, we have a huge and critical problem in our society, because the public space has been increasingly privatized. First of all, I want to get back to the government. We have governments beholden to corporate interests that control the flow of information and are not interested in engendering a public, reasonable discussion. And we need that. We need that kind of debate and reflection, not only in the legislature, we need it in the public, because the legislature responds to the people. And our media are increasingly under the control of corporations. And so, I get more balance out of reading View than the Edmonton Journal. But the vast number of people out there are not drawn into or encouraged to engage in that kind of reflection that is absolutely essential. So I'm just wondering where to go with that. I mean, is it a matter of education? I guess part of it is that human nature, one aspect of human nature that is emphasized is the competitive and selfish, and the more social and generous side of human nature is not reinforced. But wouldn't you agree that without the present privatization of the public realm dooms any possibility of achieving this kind of reasonable discussion that you're talking about?
Yes and no. I don't see it as a privatization of the public realm so much as a colonization of it. That the public realm is routinely presented as entertainment and subjected in the information we get through the major venues. View is obviously an exception, but the information we get is consumer oriented and subject to marketing and the laws of the market. Until something is done about that, I think we're in real trouble. But so I see colonization essentially by alien values. I would dearly love. I remember saying this to Knowlton Nash one time, back when he was a podcaster. I reminded him of a particular newscast that he had read, and I said to him, when you finish, I can't remember what it was, but I said, when you got to the end of it, why didn't you put the piece of paper down and laugh? I mean, you knew it was A, false, and spin, but silly. So the government today announced that. Well, who would have thought they would try something so stupid? Well, you can't do that, but I guess you can. Your question and your issue raises a whole lot. I mean, it's not something we can do like that. Public education has been, I think, not a uniform disaster in this respect, but it has been more negative than positive, in my opinion, in its delivery. I don't see that as irretrievable. What I do want to do, though, is cite as a problem, not as a solution, but cite as a problem. This goes back to Stephen's concern. I want to cite Barack Obama as an instance of this. And I want to cite two things about Obama. I'm very interested in this because, in fact, when Obama went to university and then when he went to law school, he was taught by people who themselves had been taught by John Rawls, and who took this idea I had been promoting about an elevated kind of fairness and the need to hear. They took that very seriously. And when he was the editor of the Harvard Law Review, he pushed that as a political judicial strategy. So I believe on the basis, in fact, you may, looking at Nick, there are probably other historians here, but I know that you are. Do you know Kloppenberg's book, Reading Obama? It's a very interesting, it's a pun on a book about Rawls, in fact, but it's an effort to talks about Obama's education and the people he read and the people by whom he was taught, very much in these terms. And I want to say this because I see Obama as trying to do the kinds of things that we've all been talking about here. That is to say, we've been talking about different things, but I think everyone so far has indicated agreement with and a wish that we could raise the level of public talk, that we could raise it particularly in terms that we're not just more informed, but more respectful of differing points of view, that saw differing points of view as something to learn from. I think Obama ran substantially on that. Not that alone, but I think that was a very substantial source of his appeal. I respect that. I really want it to win. And every day when I read the newspapers, I'm discouraged. One friend of mine described it as saying, it's all well and fine to have that view, but you got to have Gordie Howe elbows if you're going to have that view. In other words, if we're going to raise the level, like we can't bring these things about just by doing them ourselves. Personally, I don't know whether this is possible, but I wish Obama and his followers had made the people who have insisted on the politics of polarization, on the politics of the gutter, on the politics of misinformation. I wish the people who know that that's wrong made the people who do it pay for doing it. I think the people who, like, those are egregious insults to the community, in quotes. Egregious insults. And I have yet to see anyone hung out to dry on it. I see the guys, the people who are trying to bring about a sense of listening and paying attention and proceeding on the basis of collaboration. I see them as the ones who are being made to pay. Now, you'll note there's a complete absence of strategy, solution in this. So when I have no idea what can be done, but I see the issue that you raise, and Stephen in a way before you, but certainly the way you raise it, I see that as really having come to a head very dramatically in the last 4 months in American federal politics. And if you cite the media, can you imagine reading a newscast on a major, would you yourself be able to read a newscast in which you talk with a straight face about the deliberate obfuscation, the deliberate denigration of truth values in the way that's been going on? We do those things because we're not thinking, but if we're thinking about what we're doing, none of us could do that. Well, is that a solution? No, it just depresses the royal hell out of me, and I wish you hadn't brought my attention to it again.
We are going to have to break for 10 to 15 minutes. You can go to our Steeps colleagues and refresh your cups, talk together, and come back for the final part of our conversation. Thank you, Don.
Well, I don't know about you guys. I had some really lively conversations, including the one just now at the break. I hope you did too. A whole lot of important issues are obviously coming out. I would just like to restate something, just so it won't be in issue. The main negative thing I've been trying to get away from is phony talk about community and common values. And about that, I've been trying to say really meanly that we can be realistic about these things, and it doesn't have to be a problem at all. And we can be realistic about divergences in the community, and that's not a threat, or doesn't have to be a threat, to fairness at all. And so the main thing I would like to see two things come out of this. One is negative and one, not our discussion, but in the world. One is negative and one is positive. I'd like to, wouldn't we all, like there to be substantially less bullshit about the Canadian identity, about our politics, about all that stuff. It's not just, as Orwell said, the trouble with bullshit isn't primarily that it's false, which it is, but that it's dangerous. Because it goes with things like lazy-mindedness and intolerance. So that's on the one side. So, now, and then on the positive side, there is a sense, of course, in which we are a community. And that goes well beyond just a bunch of eyes. This room, we could say, is a community. There is, I don't know that we have to have an identical purpose, each of us, but there is a community here. There's all kinds of overlap. We take different things, we have different kinds of things in common. But what I want to oppose, what I want to oppose is talk about the Philosophers Café tradition is this, right? And so that's how we're going to do things. Not to the exclusion of paying attention to how we have done things, but just that's the tradition. I want to like bury that as just Kant. And what I sort of hope that we look for is a kind of fairness that starts with respect for the equality of other people, however stupid, weird, misbegotten. I'm talking about people with whom I, like Tea Party people in the United States, people that I have difficulty thinking they're members of the same species. But I would like to see practices in politics that take that very seriously and that punish casual deviations from it.
I wanted to make the point, I appreciate the point you made earlier about institutions and fairness in institutions. And I was just wondering, there doesn't seem to be in your structure a way to articulate the ground of that fairness. That fairness, I think, really has to be there, and the people in the institutions have to want to be fair, and that desire to be fair comes from a certain ground. And I think in that, Professor Tweedle's correct, you need to articulate at least that aspect of your overarching community in order that your institutions can be fair and your community can be sustained.
I don't disagree with that if we understand it in one way rather than another. There's important wordsmithing that has to go on, and that it's important politically. So we can describe ourselves as I would say, most Canadians really do think they believe in fairness, freedom, and equality understood as rights. I don't mean that as a complete catalog. They're just things that come immediately to mind. But I would be surprised if I met someone on the street who didn't sign off on each of those.
But why?
Well, see, you want to ask why. I want to say, do they all understand the same thing by them? And that's where the political wordsmithing comes in, but also substantial degrees of bullshit. Right? Now, yeah, are there genuine commitments involved in them? Yes, but they're very frequently different kinds of commitments. Not commitments that exclude one another, but just, I mean, they're different exclusions in the sense that some years ago I took, as part of my professional development at the University of Alberta, we're entitled to a free course. So I took wine tasting. And I remember the guy who taught the course, he was asked, what do you drink wine every day? He says, yes, with supper, I always drink wine with supper. What do you drink? And he said, when I go home, I'm going to drink. And then he named something that was basic, cheap wine, right? And there was a kind of motion of sort of horror in some parts of the room, like, we thought you believed it. You know. And he said, I'll never forget him saying this, I never met a wine I didn't like. Right. Okay, I agree with him in that. Well, I met some that didn't like me, but I've never met a wine I didn't like. But wines are different, and under that common word, wine, there's a lot of different experiences and a lot of very different kinds of wine. So under the expression rights, equality, freedom, and fairness, there are or can be quite different conceptions.
I appreciate that. And there can be a lot of different conceptions. There is one conception in particular, which I think is particularly damaging, having to do with an overriding pragmatism in human relationships, as opposed to mutual respect, honesty, and things such as that. What I'm concerned about in the way that you approach the topic is there's no way to differentiate between that ungrounded, pragmatic fairness that serves to get someone the appropriate job, as opposed to a real moral fairness that someone really feels. You know what I mean?
I do, absolutely.
And so the point I'm making is there has to be some structure that makes the fairness in the institutions that moral, good, grounded sort, as opposed to the pragmatic sort.
And I want to say more than, I mean, it's not just the pragmatic. I mean, pragmatic has different meanings. I think by pragmatic you mean not workable, but rather phony, spinning.
I mean, yeah, if I may.
Yeah.
I mean, personally viable. I suppose for me, pragmatic is a word that is applied personally and individually.
Okay. No, but I'm just trying to get clear on the point that's there. It seems to me it's come up a whole bunch of times. I have been a complete failure. I felt that this morning when I was trying to prepare the, just a second. I ordinarily like prepare my remarks and then digest them into something like 7 words on a sheet of paper, you know, just in case I lose my way, I look at that one word. Well, I mean, I was all over the place this morning because I realized, I didn't realize people were going to ask the question, but I started thinking more about what does it mean? How do we do it? And I believe in politics. I mean, I really believe in politics. That's my favorite. So I think that's maybe, there is no more activity that human beings can do that's more important. And so I'm not being glib when I say I feel badly that I came in here with a message on these things, but unable to spell out an institutional strategy or a way of making it work. I do think we, first of all, have to take these things seriously. Of course, I don't think you would disagree with that. So you're absolutely right. But then and that's why I used Obama and Obama's plight as I think, a very interesting case of this, because I didn't say, but I think it would generally be agreed, I think Obama and those who support his agenda thought that the political process would be more receptive. I don't think 3 years ago anyone? No. I don't remember anyone thinking, I remember saying there are a lot of people who are not going to buy anything Obama pushes because it comes from a black American. Yeah, lots of people held that view. I suspect it's true, and I suspect is partly explains in some quarters what's going on. I don't know any commentator, and I read a lot of them, who anticipated the depth of the line in the sand polarization, and the willingness to misdescribe, to lie, to simplify in ways that are desperate tragedies. So I'm not being debating when I say this. If you have suggestions about where this goes, I mean, what I'm trying to say by that is I hope this isn't true, but I'm afraid that what we're seeing with Obama is that the standard political process doesn't receive this kind of fairness and isn't going to if we don't do something that involves more elbows
Or more cameras.
or more.
Cameras. Just get cameras in the meetings, and let's see how these guys are meeting and what they're talking about. And if we knew what they were talking about and how they're talking about it, then it'd be obvious who we should vote for.
Oh, I'm afraid these guys are pretty good
Oh,
at
sure. Yeah, I'm just saying.
evading the camera and the microphone. So does anybody have any suggestions, like what do we do?
This is a Philosophers Café. Martin Tweedale has made it very clear from the beginning, and he has actually censored everybody who's come in, who actually wanted to be practical, and who wanted to find some kind of solution. Don, I don't know why you must have missed that one.
If you're looking for a solution, to articulate the reality of truth, you know, I mean, it doesn't have to be in one particular perspective or another. I think if the intellectual community accepts truth as something real, rather than this disagreement that we always have, and as though that's the normal state. It's not. I think normally we're working together in a viable community because it reflect some reasonable grounded functioning, you know, and that's part of the truth of it. What's the truth of it, you know? And then I think that has to do with empathy and responsibility. And these are real words, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that.
Yeah.
Don, I don't have any solutions to this question either, but just a couple of experiences. I think one thing which really doesn't, and you haven't been doing this, I don't think, but one thing which really doesn't serve the interests of progressive politics is to demonize the opposition. Now, the Tea Party hold views which I find very obnoxious, but I've encountered similar views up in Athabasca, where my university is, amongst ordinary people who live, farmers in that area, who'd like to reintroduce capital punishment, who'd like to outlaw homosexuality, who'd like to repeal abortion laws and all the rest of it. And these are frequently, if you don't mind me saying so, very nice people in many other respects. If my house caught fire, they'd be the first on the spot to, but they just hold views which are not the same as mine. So at times like that, I remember people like Tommy Douglas, who came out of a farming prairie background, from a constituency which is, in a sense, notorious for its rugged individualism, for its dislike of big government. Populist movements come out of these kind of agrarian backgrounds. And Tommy Douglas was very hard-working in most respects of his life. And I remember, because I wasn't in Canada at the time he was here, but I heard a speech that he gave one time, in which he was explaining to a farming community the parallel between a cream separator and the capitalist system, which creamed off the surplus value, the products of the surplus value, and left the workers with nothing other than their own subsistence. And the way he did this was remarkable, because he used the imagery, the metaphor that the farmers would understand. And rather than demonize and polarize the opposition, he took it upon himself to work within that constituency. And rather than alienate it and look down on it, he took the responsibility to, in a sense, struggle in his own way to win over to a more progressive position. And to be honest, I think that's the only way, because the reason people are attracted to the Tea Party may partly be through racism, but I don't think that's the whole story.
I didn't say that.
No, but a lot of people are attracted to the right wing partly because they are hurting. The working class in the United States is bearing the brunt of the financial mismanagement and the misdemeanors of the financial and political classes. And these are people who are losing jobs. We know the story. They're losing unemployment insurance. 25% of them are not even medically insured, and so on and so forth. And if these are areas where there is no tradition of left-wing organization, then why should we be surprised if the right wing steps right in and organizes them in the absence of anyone else? I mean, isn't that how Hitler, in a sense, organized the brown shirts after the Treaty of Versailles, when Germany felt like a downtrodden country, quite justifiably in some respects? So I don't have any answers either, but in my politics, and it is, as you know, left-wing politics, but I think it's much harder to stand within the community that you are trying to persuade and to convince and to struggle with, and regard them as equals and treat them with respect, even though they don't share your views. They may have views which are diametrically opposed to what you think. But to look down upon them, to alienate them, is a surefire way of losing them entirely as any potential constituency, I think.
That's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I could not possibly agree more. So, yeah, there are people in the Tea Party who say goofy things. There are people in the NDP who say goofy things. There are people in Don Carmichael's household, when everybody except him is away, who say goofy things. I mean, yeah. For whatever it's worth, though, I would say two things. After my first year of university, after my horizons had been expanded considerably by meeting a Jewish girl, kissing a Protestant girl, it was like, I was in a room that John Diefenbaker addressed. Now, John Diefenbaker was a wonderful orator. He was no Tommy Douglas. Tommy Douglas is the finest orator, finer than Tony Blair, finest orator of my generation, I believe, of my lifetime. But Diefenbaker in a small room he was magic. And the result of that was there was a federal election that spring. And I went out and joined the Conservative Party and worked really hard for the Conservatives. Big deal. He was a good guy. He won. I also had the rare experience of working for someone who won. That doesn't happen often. But I would say, like, flippancy aside, I've been really, I want to tell you something personal. I've been really lucky in my life in all kinds of ways. But there are two things that happened where people singled me out in a way that I treasure beyond description. On two different occasions, I was thanked by rookie MPs in their maiden speeches in the House of Commons. I was thanked as a teacher. They were both conservatives. And people value different things. But I'd already said earlier how I care about politics. That's beyond compare for me. So, you're absolutely right. Bearing in mind, of course, that there's also the having fun. So we do like to describe the people who disagree with us and I would start with each of those conservative MPs. If we were together, I would have things to say about them, and they would have things to say about me. That would be stereotyping and so on. But so now the real message in this that I hear you making, Tony, is, like, in terms of what we do is, well, we just start where we have to start, with ourselves and our own practices, and we just have to be careful about those things we do. I would say among the liberal, I don't want to say anyone is guiltier than anyone else, but boy, the social democratic left in our own community is not immune to that kind of stereotyping. And as I said, I think it's okay if you're having a beer and having fun. It's not okay if you're expressing your considered view.
But isn't it the case, I mean, to go to the States again where things are a bit clearer, that, I mean, the appeal of the Tea Party and the right in America is largely because they obviously represent certain kinds of traditional cultural values. And part of the reason that they're so upset and angry at the way things have gone is that those traditional cultural values of America have, are gradually eroding, well, pretty fast eroding and disappearing. Whereas the Democratic Party really hasn't represented much in the way of values for the whole country for a long time. Really, I mean, it's, they support, equal rights for women and equal rights for gays and things of this sort. But so far as values for the country as a whole, they really haven't, they've abandoned that. They had it back in the time of Roosevelt and the New Deal, but they haven't had it for quite a few decades. So, I mean, the thing is that you're not going to really make inroads with the right unless you're willing to buy into a certain kind of cultural values. I guess it goes back to this point again. Without these cultural values, things seem to fall apart in that people with power, Wall Street, the bankers, etc., exercise their power and set up an unfair society.
Well, politically, we do disagree on that last point, I think, because I think the evils that you're talking about are quite clear. And I think they're quite clearly evils in terms of the values and the different values of most Americans and most Canadians. Lying and fraudulent misuse of other people's money is, I think, widely recognized as evil. Lying and deception and the abuse of power to disguise that, likewise. Suborning due process to prevent that being investigated, likewise. Where there's a problem, and I think I'm going to agree with you here, just before I see you grabbing the mic, but let me say one thing on the other side. Like, this is the first in a series of sessions, and I mentioned at the start that in my opinion, a lot of the sort of texture of the sessions to come, certainly this one, were prompted by things that people said, not animators, but people sitting in the sessions last year, and certainly I heard in the sessions I attended, a number of times, people raising the question of culture and of community and of that, what kind of basis that provides. Now, I'd like to say something, just a personal view. I don't know that I can defend it, and there probably could if we had lots of time, but it doesn't matter. I suppose some people will hold this against me, but since the mid-'80s, I believe the left in this country, by the left I don't mean where Tony and I were once, I mean moderate people who believe in public values like public education, public health, and so on, that you might call social democratic if you wanted, but which you would call liberal in the United States. I believe that the movement to protect, the movement to build that kind of society has stalled in this country and has been stalled since the mid-'80s. That is to say, for a couple of decades, for over a generation. And specifically where it has stalled, it seems to me, is on the notion of community and of values. Now, so I want to agree with the force that you're pushing for, that we need to talk about these things and we need to act together. If we're going to have the kind of politics and the kind of society and the kinds of health and the kind of education that we want and that we need, if we're going to have those things, we have to work together, we have to build them, and that takes work. And so we have to do that stuff as a, quote, community. I only wanted to say we have to be careful about the kind of community it is. It can't be the kind of community that John Diefenbaker was talking about in that room in 1957, which is a room made up exclusively of young men who are all white. It can't be that kind of community. And certainly when Diefenbaker talked about his vision of Canada, it was a Canada for people of that kind. Well, Canada's not that kind of country anymore. So we have to talk about the country and the kinds of things projects we're trying to build in ways that really reflect and inflect the values that are actually held. But I am with you 100% that we have to act out of those value commitments. We have to make them stick. We have to punish people who don't respect them, especially people who violate them. And I wanted to give, if I could just repeat this, I would say over the last 30 years, it seems to me that thinking on the right has flourished. I don't think it's flourishing now. I think that I haven't seen particularly interesting ideas on the right, new ideas in the last 5 or 10 years. But certainly since the early to mid-'80s, there's been a real flourishing of ideas, a lot of it backward-looking, but still of energy with those ideas, and of people working together around those ideas. I think on the left, we are looking more backward. I think we are still trying to get back to 1961, the founding of the NDP. I don't detect on the left, among students or among the people I work with, any sense of the challenge of the future. What we want to do is to defend what we already have. but I don't see the sense of needing to build new things.
Yeah, I apologize for mixing some things up, because when I talked about values, I really wasn't talking about procedural kinds of values like fairness and respect for other people's opinions and that sort of thing. What I was talking about is more what you got onto there. Think of it in terms of what's Canada's project, right? And I'm not sure Canada's ever had a project, really. I mean, other than rip out the resources and sell them and get wealthy as possible, something like that. Canada as a whole has never had a project. There's been communities within Canada which have had other projects, et cetera.
The railroad.
And things like that. But the United States always had a sort of a project circulating around freedom, individual enterprise, that sort of thing, and running a society on the basis of that. Now, I mean, that project may have grave problems in it, but that's the thing that I was really talking about, a project. And the right, I think, has a project.
Yep.
Right. Whereas I think the left really doesn't have a project. All it has is what you were espousing before the break, these various procedural values. Now let's respect each other, listen to each other, let's be fair, and that sort of thing, which is all fine. I mean, if you don't have that, the fellow's left now, you got nothing. But I mean, what I think I've been trying to push here is that you need the other thing if you're going to have a fair society.
And I don't want to reply to that, I want to add on to it. I think what we've had when it comes to cultural diversity so far is something that's really just phony. It's like Heritage Days. We have all these different kinds of people, and they do different things. Well, we don't really know that they do different things because we don't know what they do when they go home, but they probably do different things, and it's cute. And that's what I think of as what multiculturalism has become. And I think so long as we have that, then, so we have this apparent community that I think is a phony community because it's not based on anything real. And so when I push for this proceduralism, it's not to make that the be-all and end-all. It's to make it possible for people to encounter one another and build things together. I don't think it would ever be the case that a Muslim guy of my age and I would agree on everything for the same reason that you and I don't agree on everything. But we're not able right now, like you and I are able to work on things because we understand one another. And I don't think we have that effective understanding, at least not at any depth, in our communities. So that's really the kind of thing that I've been pushing at. And I don't see any disagreement between us on that point.
One really quick addendum to what you said. I tend to share your view that the left, in a sense, has lost its vision. But the other half of that is that many other constituencies have not lost their vision. The environmentalists know exactly what they want. The global justice community knows. The gay, lesbian, trans, the animal rights. So part of the new politics, I think, without spending too much time on this, is what some writers have called the creation of a counter-hegemonic alliance. Part of the new politics is how we link together these different disparate groups which all find the existing status quo is limiting the possibilities of growth and sustainability in different ways, environmentally, civil rights, sexual rights, and so on and so forth. So class politics has, in a sense, already been transcended by various types of identity politics and special interest groups. The question is, how do we create a forum to link them together?
I don't want to link them together. I profoundly don't want to link them together. I want people who care about those things to care about them and push them as hard as they can. I want there to be linkage, but I want there to be linkage around other things. Let me just give one example, two examples. I think there are two major public projects, public goods that are in real trouble. One of them is public health, which is rapidly becoming some kind of joke. And the other is public education, likewise. Okay. Now, I don't think we can talk seriously about improving the quality of public education unless we're prepared to get past the cultural, religious, value differences and like come to understandings with one another and then move forward on that basis. Likewise, the case with public health is different, but certainly people with these various other causes that they care about, I think generally do also agree on things like public education and public health. So there are these like if we're looking for what Martin called a project, we don't all have to care just about one thing, right? But we can find some broadly common projects. And what I meant about public health is this. I cited a few minutes ago over my lifetime, I think the left kind of stopped thinking, like, stopped seeing new horizons, and the right didn't. I am just astonished at the lack, I'm going to use a word that those demonized right-wingers use. I'm just astonished in Canada and in Britain, especially even more Britain, at the lack of choice that there is in public health care. I'm just astonished at the... don't get me wrong, I'm not proposing we should turn it into a market and that we should apply market principles. But what we have is a dictatorship of the healthcare professional. And that wasn't in anybody's mind, I think, when they set up public health care in this country. But it's what we've got. Now, and you know, people on the left or the moderates will recognize this to degrees when they recognize the appeal of these abuses, like the long waiting times in emergencies. Well, why are there long waiting times? Well, is it because we don't have enough doctors? No, we don't have enough space. Why don't we have enough space? In some cases, we don't have enough space because we've got elderly people parked there because there's no place for them to go. How long does it take to build a quality senior care facility? It's not like building a hospital. I asked a guy in the construction industry about this in the States last spring. And he laughed and he said, well, you know, you're an academic. You're not going to like this answer. I said, well, why? And he said, he's in the construction industry. He said, start to finish, it would take me, from the time they say go, I could build a hospital, a really good hospital, in 9 months. He said, but it takes about 10 years to build a hospital because of you guys. Like all the discussions that have to go on over what it's going to be like and what the facilities are going to be and how it's going to be patient friendly. He said, I have to add, then he looked at me and he said, you know, Don, the difference between you and me is I bet my net worth every day, unlike you academics. And I looked him right in the eye and I said, well, John, there's another difference between you and me. It's that you have net worth. Now, joking aside, what I'm trying to say about this is we have some fairly clear issues about responsiveness of the healthcare system to patients' needs and the patient. And I don't mean to fault the desire and the willingness and the work of any one person in this. I don't mean that at all. But I do mean that the value of public health care doesn't seem to include the value of input from the patient as centrally as it should.
I wanted to. Thank you so much, Don. That was great. I wanted to mention a couple of things. A kind of footnote to one of Don's asides. I like doing footnotes to footnotes. I do not know, but I suspect that one of those MPs that thanked Don from the floor was probably James Rajat, who I understand still remains a student of Don's. At least that's what he told me last time I met with him, James, that is. This is down the pipe a little way, but the Ronning Center does a series of forums with politicians, and I do it under the title, The Highest Public Calling, a conversation on religion and public life. And James Rajat will be doing that with us, and we're holding it. We're going to a place where I hope you will come, given your wonderful comments. We're holding it in the Leduc Alliance Church. It's going to be on the 9th of November at 7 p.m. It's time to go to those places. In any case, James has a lovely mind, and I'm hoping Don will come and be his first interlocutor. I wanted to mention that the next Philosophers Café is on the 1st of October, and it is called Power Down to a Post-Carbon Future, and it'll be with Gordon Laxer. I also wanted to mention two other things. One is on Monday, the 3rd of October, in the Political Science Conference Room, which Don normally occupies, but he was willing to make a little bit of space there, at 3 in the afternoon. We have a seminar with Rabbi Daniel Friedman, who's a graduate student in political science. The title is The Clash of Civilizations, Christian Zionism. He's going to be speaking about Christian Zionism work that he's doing currently for his dissertation. And then finally on the 11th of October, and this will be in Camrose, I've asked, this is a political science day today. I've asked Andy Knight, the current chair of political science, to speak about what he titles the manifestation of xeno-racism after Norway. So, is that it?
Thanks, Steve.
And to our Steeps people, thanks so much. It's lovely to be here. We appreciate it. And to you, good to see you.
See you in 2 weeks.